Good morning. Welcome to Daily Devotions with Pastor Joe. I'm Pastor Joe, and for today, we're just going to quickly go through a summary of the story of Esther, as we've already been through all of the important bits and pieces of the story leading up to the end. And at the very end, if I were to talk about chapters 9 and 10, basically, I'd just be talking about the fight and how the Jews had killed thousands and thousands of enemies. So we're going to go through a really quick summary. I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible and just kind of get all of the main details of the story of Esther into your mind so that you can share with other people the story of Esther and remember it for years and years to come. All right, King Ahasuerus held a banquet where he wanted his queen to display her beauty to a bunch of other men. She refused to do this, and he had her stripped of her crown and banished from the kingdom, no longer to be the queen. A little while after this, he held a banquet. He held essentially a beauty pageant, a period of time where he had all of the pretty young women from all of Shushan come and challenge each other to be the next queen. Mordecai, who was a Jew, had a cousin named Hadassah. We know her as Esther, and he was caring for her as if she was his own daughter because her parents had died tragically a long time before. He told her not to let anyone know that she was a Jew because it could get her in trouble, because they were a more recent captive than the others who were in the area. She was not native to Shushan. So she never did, and after 1 year of preparation, she went in to the king. He chose her for his queen. Mordecai worked at the gates of the palace and refused to bow before anyone except the Lord. That's a beautiful thing. Follow that example. Haman was the king's favorite man, basically his second in command, and the people were commanded to bow to him whenever he walked into the gates. But Mordecai didn't, and when Mordecai wouldn't bow to him, he became very angry and plotted to have all of Mordecai's people killed for his disobedience. So, like often, whenever we don't do what the devil wants, he does his best to tear up our lives and ruin those around us. The king allowed Haman to create a law, and let me correct that, to create a law that on a certain day of the year, anyone who wanted could kill all the Jews they found and steal all of the Jews' things. Mordecai wept very bitterly about this, and he sat at the gate of the palace wearing sackcloth and ashes, which is a very strong sign of a very deep and bitter sorrow and sadness. And all of the Jews in town, including him, had been fasting. They fasted for several days. When he confronted Esther about this, she found out what he was doing, and she confronted him, and he told her what was going on. Esther was afraid to speak to the king about the matter because he had not wanted to see her for the past 30 days. He had never called for her. And the problem is, in that time and in that kingdom, if you came to the king to talk to him and he hadn't called for you and he didn't accept you because he was a little grumpy that day, you lost your life. And so she was very afraid to come to the king and end up losing her life over this matter. But Mordecai told her that if she didn't rescue the Jews by going to the king, that someone else would surely be raised up to rescue them and she wouldn't survive. Also, he made a very clear point that he believed she was elevated to her high position for just such the occasion as this. After 3 days of fasting, she went to the king. He was very excited to see her, and she invited him to bring Haman and have a meal at her house. After the meal, the king asked what she really wanted because he didn't believe she just wanted to have dinner with him. She invited them to come back and have another meal. Haman, before this second meal, felt so on top of the world and so great for the queen loving him so much that he built a 90-foot gallows and planned to kill Mordecai on that the next day. But when he went to the king, he didn't get to make his special request to do this thing. And by the way, the word for gallows here, we're not 100% sure whether the gallows they're talking about is actually a hanging gallows. Some scholars actually believe that it may have been something meant to impale you slowly. So there is that. 90 feet is an awful, awful high distance to be killed no matter what, and being killed in either fashion is horrible. But he didn't get to make a special request because, you see, the king hadn't been able to sleep all night. And so while he was laying there trying to sleep, he said, "Read me a bedtime story." They read him a story about himself, of course. because why wouldn't you? And they read a part of his history and found out that they never got to repay Mordecai for saving the king's life, because Mordecai had heard about a plot to kill the king and tipped off the royal advisors. Whoever the king found out had the men taken and disposed of. Haman thought that the king wanted to honor him when he was called in by the king and asked what the king should do when he wanted to honor somebody. So Haman created an elaborate idea of having someone lead the honorable one around on horseback, while the rider wore the king's crown and robes, and the front runner would shout that this was the way the king honored someone. After he was done leading the procession, because the king, of course, told him to do all of this to Mordecai, he was ashamed. And ashamed, Haman runs home, tells his friends and his wife all that had happened, and they warn him that this is not going to end well for him, because they said, hey, if he's one of those Jews you're talking about, you're in trouble. So it was time to go to the second dinner. He barely had time to get ready for it, dressed, cleaned up, whatever, ran out the door, went, because as he was speaking, it says that the men came in and said it's time to go to the dinner. So at the second dinner, Esther tells the king about Haman's plot. I'm sure Haman became white as a ghost, struck with fear. The king stormed out furiously into the garden to clear his head. Haman ran over to Esther, threw himself at her mercies, threw himself so much that he was on the couch, and who knows if he didn't have his pleading hands right there by her. And when he threw himself down, he was begging for his life. The king saw this, came back in from the garden, saw this, and thought that Haman was trying to take advantage of Esther, and had him hung on his own gallows that he had built for Mordecai. Esther, the king, and Mordecai took the time to write a new law that permitted the Jews to kill their enemies on a certain day, much like Haman's, only really as a ahead of time attack to stave off any of the possibility of the others following the other law. When this became a success, and I believe it says 75,000 people that they killed in one day, they wrote a second letter to have it continue to a second day, and there was at least 300 in Shushan alone that lost their lives there. The people were so afraid that the Bible says that the men were choosing to become Jews themselves in order to stay out of trouble and losing their lives. In the end, at the end of chapter 10, it says Mordecai becomes the second in command beneath King Ahasuerus. We hear this story a lot in the Bible with Joseph and the Pharaoh and with several others throughout time, that whenever they're obeying God and God raises them up to this position where they gain some great notoriety and become the second in command. But he becomes a great leader during this portion of their captivity and rescues them and teaches them things and just helps them in general to become better people and to live in peace. And so the story of Esther is very interesting. It's very awesome to look at a few parts of it, that whenever God puts you in a place, sometimes he puts you there for a specific reason, and sometimes he will lift people up to great high heights. There have been some people who've been granted the ability to make tons of money that are great Christians, and God continues to pour money into their lives so that they can continue to fund the work that's being done for the missionaries, for the home church, and for other people who are doing God's work. Sometimes God puts you in a place where you just get amazing opportunities to minister to people and to help people. I love what is going on in my own life, and I hope you love and have found to love what has been going on in your life as God has been using you, because God wants to use every person in a special way. He's given you gifts, position, ability, whatever he's given you, so that you can do something specific. He has a plan and a purpose for your life, just like he did for Esther. Now, we know there are a few bad things. One is that you don't bow down to anybody besides God. You can learn that as a negative, yet a positive. In this story, you only bow to the Lord. You don't bow to people, even under the pressure of being killed, because God has a plan and a purpose even in that. We can also see that Haman was very greedy, very selfish, very self-centered, very full of himself, and those are all very bad things, bad traits that we don't want to have. We can see that they had a little bit of trouble, possibly caused by the fact that they didn't reveal that she was a Jewess. Instead of just saying, hey, I am, they hid that from everybody, and it doesn't end up being the easiest thing for them to face because of that. And so maybe if she would have just said, hey, king, at one night, any night, when she was with him, said, I'm a Jew, maybe that would have helped to have curbed the entire thing, but she didn't. And God worked through this imperfect situation anyway. So, I'm not going to say that you're going to have as great of a life as Mordecai or as Esther or as great of a story, but serve God, live for Him, live the way you're supposed to. Don't go and serve other people or live for other people, but serve the Lord. I hope you've enjoyed this study of the book of Esther over the last 10, this will be 10 weeks. It's been great. I've enjoyed just getting a little deeper into Esther than I have in the past, and maybe we'll do it again sometime in the future, but the next week on Saturday, we'll be starting studying the book of Ruth and Naomi's life, and it's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic, and I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. If you're new, share this with a friend. Give me some comments about what you think, and I hope you have a great day in the Lord today. God bless. I'll see you again tomorrow for another daily devotion with Pastor Joe.